The air inside the shooting range was a world unto itself, thick with the sharp, clean tang of gunpowder and old metal. It wasn't a foul smell, but a focused one, the scent of pure, undistracted concentration. The sounds of the place formed a kind of strange industrial music. The single, a sharp crack of a well-placed shot from a distant lane. The steady pop-pop-pop of someone practicing their rhythm, and the gentle, electronic whir of a target carrier being called back from the shadows. It was a sanctuary of control, a modern chapel where the only prayers were the silent ones whispered between breaths. Into this world of quiet intensity walked the young woman. She moved with a natural, unassuming grace that made the loud, clanging door behind her seem even more obnoxious. At 24, she had a calmness about her that felt earned, not feigned. She wasn't there to be seen or to make a statement. Her faded jeans were comfortable, her plain gray hoodie was soft, her long brown hair was pulled back in a simple, no-nonsense ponytail that did nothing to draw attention to her. She carried a single, hard-sided black case, but it wasn't the kind a collector or a competitive shooter might flash. It was functional, with honest scuffs on its corners that told a story of careful use, not careless display. At the check-in counter, her voice was a quiet murmur, polite and clear. "Lane 7, please." The man behind the glass nodded, handing her a tag. As she walked down the long concrete aisle, divided lanes on either side felt like private confessionals, places of solitary work. She felt the familiar sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of coming home. In her daily life, working among the hushed, towering shelves of the city library, she was surrounded by stories written by others. Here, in this noisy, gritty place, the story was her own. It was a narrative told not in words, but in the discipline of her breathing, the steady pressure of her finger, and the quiet conversation between her hands in the cold, unyielding steel of the pistol her grandfather had left her. Lane 7 was her space. She placed her case on the wooden bench with a soft, deliberate click. She didn't rush. Everything had its own time, its own place. She pulled out a pair of simple safety glasses and a set of comfortable, over-the-ear headphones. Then came the pistol, nestled in its worn holster. It was a Glock 19, a firearm known for its reliability and practicality, not for its flash. It was black, businesslike, and utterly without adornment. She laid it on the bench with the muzzle pointed safely downrange, a habit so deeply ingrained it was as natural as breathing. Next to it, she placed 2 boxes of ammunition, the brass cases gleaming softly under the fluorescent lights. Her movements were smooth and efficient, a silent, personal ritual that was both the beginning and the end of stress for her. She pinned a fresh target to the cardboard backer. A simple silhouette, the kind law enforcement used for practice. She looked at it for a moment, not with aggression, but with the quiet appraisal of a craftsman examining her materials. She pressed the button and the motor whirred, sending the target gliding smoothly away down the narrow lane. She didn't stop it at the closer, beginner-friendly distances. She sent it all the way to the end. 25 yards. A distance that spoke of confidence, a clear line drawn between the casual hobbyist and someone who had taken the time to learn the craft. She had just inserted her first magazine, the metallic click a satisfying and familiar sound, and was about to raise her firearm when the entire atmosphere of the range was violently and suddenly shattered. It was like a rock thrown into a still pond. The peace was gone, replaced by a jarring, aggressive noise. A new group had arrived, and they didn't just enter the building. They invaded it. 3 men, all in their late 20s, swaggered down the aisle like they owned the place. Their gear was brand new and ridiculously expensive, a collection of tactical fashion more than function. They had customized rifles with flashy finishes, bulky chest rigs, loaded with extra magazines, and high-tech ear protection that looked more suited for a Special Forces video game than a real shooting range. Their voices boomed, echoing off the concrete walls and completely ignoring the unspoken rule of quiet focus that governed this space. "Man, this place is awesome," one of them yelled, its voice carrying easily through the ear protection of every other shooter present. They took the lane right next to hers. Lane 8. The noise level immediately doubled. They weren't setting up their gear with any sense of care or respect. They were dumping it onto the bench. Clank, thump, rattle. One of them, a tall man with a bright red shirt and a jawline that seemed to be permanently set to smug, leaned over the low divider separating their lanes and looked into hers. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, swept over her simple setup, and then down the long lane to her distant target. A slow, arrogant grin spread across his face. He nudged one of his friends, a heavier-set man wearing a baseball cap backwards. "Hey, look at this," Red Shirt said, not bothering to lower his voice in the slightest. "Little Red Riding Hood's here." The third one, who had a nervous, fidgety energy and kept tapping a high-tech scope on his rifle, peered over the divider. "Whoa, hey, what you shooting with there, sweetheart?" The young woman did not look at them. She kept her eyes forward on her own lane. She took a slow, steady breath, the kind her grandfather had taught her to take to calm her heart before the first shot. Their words were like annoying flies buzzing around her ears. Irritating, but something you could learn to ignore if you focused on something more important. "Is that a 9mm?" Red Shirt continued, his tone dripping with a condescending amusement that was impossible to miss. "Cute. Bet that thing doesn't even kick." He snorted out a laugh. And his two buddies joined in, their voices a grating. Off-key harmony of arrogance. She could feel the eyes of a few shooters in other lanes on them, a shared sense of irritation. This was a sanctuary, and these men were the loud, disruptive tourists. Still, she did not react. To react would be to give them what they wanted, a reaction. Her grandfather's voice was a quiet, steady memory in her mind. Let them talk. The noise they make is the only shot they'll ever hit that matters. She finally raised her pistol. The feel of the grip in her hand was as familiar as her own name, an extension of her arm. Her stance was natural, her feet shoulder-width apart, her weight balanced and slightly forward. Her arms were extended but not locked, a firm but relaxed push-pull between her dominant hand and her support hand. She aligned the front and rear sights, the little white dots on the dark metal forming a perfect, crisp line. She focused on the front sight, allowing the distant target to blur just slightly. Trusting her mind and body to connect the two, she exhaled half a breath, and just as the last of the air left her lungs, she began the final, gentle squeeze of the trigger. This was her moment, her quiet conversation with the world. The universe in her lane had shrunk to the size of a front sight post. The men in the next lane, with their noise and their insecurity, were a million miles away. They were just background static. A storm she could weather in the peaceful eye of her focus, asterisk the single. Sharp crack of her first shot echoed in the sudden quiet it created. It was a clean, precise sound, distinct from the chaotic blasting that had filled the range moments before. The young woman felt the familiar, controlled push of the pistol back into her hands, a gentle and predictable force. A small wisp of gray smoke curled from the muzzle, dancing for a second in the overhead lights before being whisked away by the ventilation fans. The smell was sharp, acrid, but in a way that was comforting to her. A scent of absolute focus. She did not rush to see where it had gone. The shot felt right. The follow-through was perfect. She had held the trigger to the rear after the break, kept the sights aligned, and only then began to reset for the next one. This was the rhythm her grandfather had drilled into her. Not with a gun, but by having her throw pebbles at a tin can for hours. One shot, one breath, one thought. It wasn't about speed. It was about the unbroken chain of discipline from mind to finger to target. Asterisk the men in the next lane. However, lived by a different philosophy. Their philosophy was noise. Their shooting was a performance, a chaotic drum solo meant to impress an audience they hadn't realized they were losing. The tall man in the red shirt, who seemed to be their unofficial leader, shouldered his expensive rifle. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, all matte black finish and smooth lines, but he treated it like a toy. He didn't aim so much as point and unleash a torrent of fire. Bang, 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 bang. The shots came in a rapid, uncontrollable string, the muzzle climbing with each report. The sound a deafening roar that bounced painfully off the concrete walls. When the barrage stopped, He let out a loud, self-satisfied grunt. Woo! Did you feel that? This thing is a monster. He shouted to his friends, slapping the side of his rifle. His friend in the backwards cap whistled. Yeah, bro, you were tearing it up. The third one, the one who kept fidgeting with his scope, nodded enthusiastically, though he had been too busy trying to adjust a knob on his expensive optic to actually see where the shots had gone. The young woman in lane 7 ignored them. She had already settled her sights again. The front post was a crisp, clear focus. The silhouette was a distant, blurry shape. She took another breath, let half of it out, and gently, steadily, squeezed the rearward pressure on the trigger until the pistol spoke again. Crack. Another clean, solitary report. It was a statement of its own, a quiet refusal to participate in their noise. She ejected the empty magazine, the motion fluid and automatic, and inserted a fresh one. She was getting into her groove now, falling into that meditative state where the world outside her lane simply faded away. But her refusal to engage was being read completely wrong by the men. They saw her quiet, deliberate pace not as discipline, but as weakness. As fear. The loud man in the red shirt, whose name was Brad but who everyone just called Red, was getting irritated. He glanced over the partition again. He saw her target was still at 25 yards. He saw her slow, methodical movements. His own target, when he finally sent it back after his first magazine, was a mess. The holes were scattered all over the silhouette, from the neck to the hips, with a few even missing the paper entirely. It was the pattern of someone who was more interested in the sound of the gun than the destination of the bullet. Look at her, Red muttered to his friend in the backwards cap. Dave, she's taking like a minute between shots. What's she even doing? Praying to it? Dave chuckled, leaning over to get a better look. Man, she's scared of it. I bet it's kicking her all over the place. That's a little gun. But for someone who doesn't know what they're doing? He let the sentence hang, the implication clear. Their taunts were, for now, just between them. But the more they shot, the more frustrated they became, and the more they focused their frustration on her. Their shooting didn't get better. They were all show and no substance. They spent more time talking about how great their gear was than actually using it effectively. They'd fire a few shots, check the target, groan about how the wind must have shifted or how the range's lighting was bad, and then launch into another noisy, ineffective volley. After another 5 minutes of her quiet, popping shots and their roaring strings of fire, the mockery grew louder and more direct. It started with Red, who leaned his whole body over the low divider, completely ignoring the concept of personal space. He was holding his rifle by its pistol grip, letting it dangle casually. A profoundly unsafe move that made the young woman's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Sweetheart, he called out, his voice loud and syrupy with condescension. You need some help with that? I can show you how to actually hold a gun. He gestured with his own rifle, a foolish and dangerous waving motion. A few shooters in distant lanes glanced over, their expressions unreadable behind their safety glasses. But their body language showed a clear disapproval. She did not answer. She simply took her empty magazine from the pistol and placed it neatly on the bench. She was reloading another, her fingers moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from thousands of repetitions. Her silence was like a wall. For most people, it would have been a clear signal to leave her alone. For Red, it was an invitation. Ah, she's shy, Dave chimed in, his voice laced with a sneer. Don't worry, we don't bite. We just don't want to see you hurt yourself with that thing. Looks like it has a real kick. The Glock 19 was known for its manageable recoil, but he was clearly trying to wind her up. The third friend, a lanky guy named Tom, who seemed to be trying a little too hard to fit in, finally piped up. Yeah, you gotta have some muscles to handle a real gun, you know? Maybe you should stick to the .22s. He snickered at his own joke, looking too red for approval. Red clapped him on the back. Good one, Tom, Red said, his eyes still locked on the young woman. Seriously, though, we can help. We're experts. The word experts came out with such profound, unearned confidence, it was almost laughable. An expert in what? She wondered. Making a racket? Being a public nuisance? She finished reloading her magazine and set it on the bench. She picked up the pistol again, and for the first time, a brief flicker of irritation crossed her mind. She was here for peace, for the solitude of the range. These men were like a virus, infecting her quiet space with their loud, toxic energy. She thought of her grandfather, a quiet, powerful man who had taught her that strength wasn't something you had to prove to anyone. It was something you just had. The loudest dog in the pack is never the leader, he used to say. He's just the one who's most scared. She raised her pistol, her back straightening a little. She tried to block them out, to find her focus again. She took a breath, but Red wasn't done. Whoa, wait a second, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still somehow louder than a normal speaking voice. He pointed a finger at her hands. Look at that little grip. You're holding it like you're afraid it's going to bite you. You're going to get a slide bite like that, sweetheart. A little tiny scar right on your thumb. Not a good look. Dave laughed again, a high, grating sound. Or worse, you'll send that thing flying back into your face. We'd better stand back. This time she did pause. She lowered the pistol slowly, holding it pointed safely downrange. She didn't look at them, not directly. She looked at their hands, their stances, the way they handled their expensive equipment like it was a prop. They had all the gear, but none of the grace. None of the humility. She could see their targets now, propped up on the bench next to theirs. The paper was shredded with random, chaotic holes. They were not shooters. They were noisemakers. Her focus began to return, not with anger, but with a cool, clear sense of resolve. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see her flustered, to see her get angry or scared. By not giving it to them, she was frustrating them more than any comeback could. So, instead of saying anything, she simply raised the pistol again. She settled into her stance, which was, in fact, perfect. Her grip was high and tight, controlling the recoil before it even began. It was a grip of knowledge, not of fear. They just didn't know the difference. The silence that hung in the air after Red's last taunt was heavy. The few other shooters nearby had paused their own shooting, silent, united front of disapproval against the men's behavior. They could all see what was happening. They could see the quiet dignity in Lane 7 and the obnoxious posturing in Lane 8. The young woman ignored the tension in the audience. She aligned her sights. The world narrowed to that little white front post and the blurry target 25 yards away. The men's voices faded into the background. She was back in her library, a place of order and quiet respect. The chaos in the next aisle did not matter. The book on her desk was the only thing that needed her attention. In this case, the book was her pistol, and the story was the bullet she was about to write. She breathed. She squeezed. The pistol barked its sharp, solitary report. It was the only answer she was going to give, and for a moment it was enough. But she knew, and everyone else watching knew, that something had to give. The men's mockery had been hanging in the air like a bad smell. And now, with her perfect, quiet defiance, it had become a challenge. A gauntlet had been thrown down, not with words, but with a single well-placed hole in a piece of paper. The air was thick with unspoken words, and everyone was waiting to see who would speak next. Asterisk, the silence that followed her last. Shot was different from the quiet that had come before. The previous quiet had been one of concentration, the natural state of a serious shooter. This new silence was thick with tension. It was the silence of an audience holding its breath. The few shooters in the surrounding lanes had all stopped. They stood behind their benches, pistols and rifles laid down, their eyes no longer on their own targets, but on the quiet drama unfolding between lanes 7 and 8. They were a silent jury. Their collective disapproval of the men in lane 8 was a palpable force. Asterisk read. The man in the red shirt felt that disapproval like a physical pressure. He had expected the young woman to either fluster, get angry, or maybe even pack up and leave in a huff. That would have been the victory he was looking for. It would have confirmed his worldview that he was in charge, that he could intimidate anyone he wanted with enough volume and swagger. But she had done none of those things. She had simply absorbed his insults, let them slide off her like rain off a newly waxed car, and then responded with a single, perfect shot. Her quiet competence was a deeper insult than anything he could ever shout. It challenged his very sense of self, which was built entirely on a foundation of empty bravado. He couldn't let it stand. To back down now, in front of his friends and the growing audience, would be a humiliation he couldn't bear. His pride was on the line, and his pride was a wild, untamed thing. He leaned over the partition again, his knuckles white where he gripped the metal edge. The playful, condescending smirk was gone from his face, replaced by a hard-edged arrogance. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, but more intense, "you're shooting awful slow for someone who's trying to look so serious. What's the matter? Scared of it?" He paused, letting the words sink in. He looked at his friends for backup, and Dave and Tom nodded, their expressions a mix of encouragement and belligerence. Red's mind was racing, searching for the ultimate way to put her in her place. An insult wasn't enough. He needed a public reckoning, a demonstration of his superiority. He suddenly had an idea, a brilliant, foolish idea that seemed like pure gold in the moment. "How about a little wager?" he said, his voice booming again, confident that this was a checkmate he could not lose. $100 as my group is tighter than yours." This was it, the ultimate challenge. It wasn't just about shooting anymore. It was about money, about pride, about establishing a clear hierarchy on this little stretch of concrete. He was so sure of himself, so utterly convinced of his own mythical skill, that the possibility of losing never even entered his mind. He pictured her getting flustered, stammering that she couldn't possibly bet, or worse, accepting and then failing spectacularly. He could already hear the laughter from his friends and the admiring glances from the other shooters. He would be the king of the range for a day. The young woman, however, did not react the way he had planned. She did not flinch. She did not look embarrassed. She did, however, stop. Her movements, which had been so fluid and rhythmic, came to a complete and sudden halt. She lowered her pistol, not setting it down, but holding it pointed safely downrange at a 45-degree angle, a position of readiness. Then she turned, slowly, deliberately, and for the first time. She looked directly at him. It was not the look of a scared girl. It was not the look of an angry woman. It was a look of pure, unwavering focus. Her eyes, a deep, calm brown, met his. In that moment, the noisy, chaotic energy of the entire range seemed to recede, leaving only the space between them. The sounds of the ventilation system, the distant clang of another shooter's brass, all of it faded into a dull hum. It was just her and him. 100, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a sharp knife. It was clear, steady, and utterly devoid of fear. The simple, calm statement hung in the air, surprising Red more than any angry outburst could have. He recovered quickly, his swagger returning, though it felt a little less secure now. "Yeah, 100. Big money for a librarian," he sneered, making a wild and surprisingly accurate guess about her profession. She ignored the comment. Her gaze was unwavering. "We're not shooting at 25 yards, she said. The quiet authority in her tone was starting to unnerve him. "This was not how it was supposed to go," Red scoffed. "Oh yeah. What's your big idea then? 10 yards, 5? I don't want to make it too easy for you. Do it at 50, she stated, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "And you're going first?" The words landed like a punch to the gut. 50 yards. That was an entirely different world of shooting. For a pistol, especially a compact one like hers, 50 yards was a long, punishing distance. It was a distance that demanded absolute flawless execution. A tiny flaw in breathing, a minuscule waver in the grip. The slightest anticipation of the shuttle of it would be magnified, sending the bullet inches, or even feet off course. It was the distance real competitors shot at. It was a distance that separated the serious shooters from the weekend warriors. Red felt a flicker of something he didn't like. It wasn't fear, not quite, but it was a close cousin of it. It was doubt. He had never shot his rifle at 50 yards. He had never even thought about it. He was a point-and-shoot kind of guy. He had assumed they would compete on his terms, at the easy, showy distances he was used to. By changing the rules, she had immediately taken control of the situation. His friends felt it too. Dave's eyes widened slightly and he whispered, "Whoa, 50? That's far, man." Tom just stared, his mouth slightly agape. Red couldn't back down. Not now, not in front of everyone. To refuse would be an admission of fear, a defeat far more humiliating than simply losing the bet. He squared his shoulders, forcing a laugh that sounded a little hollow even to his own ears. 50, you're on, princess. You're about to be $100 poorer. You got it? Yes, she said simply. I got it. With that, she finally broke her gaze. She turned back to her bench, but instead of packing up, she did something that surprised everyone. She calmly and methodically unloaded the pistol, ejecting the round from the chamber and the magazine from the grip, placing them on the bench. Then she took out a small, compact cleaning kit and a tiny bottle of oil. She was getting ready. Not for a casual shoot, but for a serious attempt. Her quiet preparations spoke volumes, her confidence not in her mouth, but in her hands, the range safety officer. A man named Gus, who had seen more posturing and bad shooting in his 30 years on the job than most people see in a lifetime, had been watching the entire exchange from his glass-walled office. He had seen countless characters like Red come and go, all flash and no substance. He had also seen a few like the young woman, the quiet ones who carried themselves with a strange, heavy grace. He had been about to step out and shut down the confrontation, but the turn of events had captured his full attention. 50 yards. This was getting interesting. He watched her calm preparations, a slow, respectful smile touching the corners of his mouth. He decided to let it play out. A small crowd had formed now, not a mob, but a line of respectful onlookers. A few shooters from the lanes on either side, their own shooting forgotten. They created a small, silent aisle between the two benches. It was no longer just a confrontation. It was an event. Red, feeling the pressure of all the eyes on him, tried to regain his bravado. "All right, let's do this," he announced loudly, racking a new magazine into his rifle with an overly dramatic clack-clack. He checked his target, which was still at the default 15-yard setting. He stared at it for a second, as if weighing his options. He knew the distance was wrong. He knew he had to move it. But the thought of sending it all the way to 50, to her distance, felt like admitting her terms were right. So he compromised, sending it to 30 yards. It was a small act of defiance, a way of saying, "I'll play your game, but on my terms," the crowd noticed. A few of them exchanged knowing looks. Gus, in his office, shook his head slowly. A mark of an amateur. The young woman saw it too. She didn't say a word. She simply pressed the button for her own target, sending hers out to join his at 30 yards. Then she pressed it again, sending it all the way to the backstop. 50 yards. It was a quiet, unarguable statement. She had set her terms. He was the one who had to decide if he was going to meet them. The small distance between their targets, hanging in the lane like a visual representation of their disagreement, was a silent challenge. Red stared at her target, now a small, dark shape at the far end of the range. Then he looked at his own, noticeably larger and closer. The choice was clear. If he shot at 30, it would be an implicit admission that he couldn't do it at 50. He would lose the respect of the crowd before he even fired a shot. With a frustrated sigh, he stabbed the button again, sending his own target the rest of the way to 50. It bumped to a stop next to hers. "Right," he said, his voice tight. 50 it is. "Let's see what you got, bookworm." Yes. He was trying to sound tough, but the edge in his voice was pure frustration. He shouldered his rifle, the expensive stock pressing into his shoulder. He tried to settle his breathing, but he couldn't. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of nerves and anger. He was no longer the cocky shooter from the beginning. He was a man trapped by his own ego, and he knew it. Asterisk, the entire shooting range had become a stage. The air, once thick with the smell of cordite and the sound of individual focus, was now charged with a tense electric silence. Every shooter, every bystander, had become part of the audience for this impromptu contest. Their own targets lay forgotten, their own firearms resting on silent benches. All eyes were on lanes 7 and 8, This was no longer just about shooting. It was a story unfolding in real time, a classic tale of arrogance versus quiet confidence. And everyone wanted to see how it would end. Red. The man in the red shirt stood at his bench, feeling the weight of every single one of those eyes. It was a crushing pressure, one that his loud, boisterous personality was not built to withstand. He tried to project his usual confidence, puffing out his chest and adopting a wide-legged stance he had probably seen in an action movie. He gripped his expensive rifle, his knuckles a stark white against the black polymer. He wanted to look like a seasoned operator, a man who owned this moment. But inside, a frantic, nervous energy was churning. The 50-yard distance, which had seemed like just a number a few minutes ago, now felt like an impossible chasm. The small silhouette at the end of the lane seemed to mock him, a tiny black speck that was impossibly far away. He glanced over at his friends, looking for a scrap of his old bravado. Dave and Tom were watching him with wide, expectant eyes, their own earlier mockery now forgotten. They were relying on him to perform, to be the leader they had followed in here. He gave them a sharp, confident nod that he didn't feel. Then he looked at the young woman. She was simply standing by her bench, her pistol still unloaded and resting beside her cleaning kit. She was watching him, but her expression was not one of anticipation or excitement. It was the same calm, appraising look she had given her target when she first arrived. She was a student of the moment, observing his every move with a quiet intensity that was more unnerving than any glare. He had to do something. He had to act. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, he shouldered the rifle properly this time, pressing the stock firmly into his cheek. The weight of the gun felt different now, heavier, more cumbersome. He peered through the high-tech scope. The magnification made the target appear closer, but it also amplified every tiny tremor in his hands, every slight movement of his chest as he breathed. The crosshairs, which were supposed to be steady, were dancing a nervous jig across the black paper. This was not a slow, deliberate shot like hers. This had to be a performance. He had to show them all. He let out half his breath, but his lungs were burning, desperate for air. He tried to time the shot, but his patience was gone. He pulled the trigger. The rifle roared, the sound far louder and more violent than the controlled cracks from her pistol. The shot was high, kicking up a puff of dirt on the berm just above the target. A miss. A hot wave of shame washed over him. He could feel the collective disappointment of the silent crowd. He couldn't miss. Not now. Panic set in. He abandoned all pretense of technique. He jerked the trigger again. Crack. Another miss, this time to the left. Frustration boiled over into a furious, rapid-fire string. Crack dash crack dash crack dash crack dash crack. He emptied the rest of the magazine in a wild, adrenaline-fueled spray. A desperate attempt to hit anything at all. When the last echo faded, a profound silence fell over the range. The air tasted of his failure. He lowered the rifle, his shoulder aching from the uncontrolled recoil. His face was flushed a deep, blotchy red, a color that seemed to bleed all the way from the neck of his shirt. He didn't want to look at his target. He knew it would be a disaster, but he had to. He had to face the music. He pressed the button to call it back. The motor whirred, and the long, painful journey began. The target came closer, and the full extent of his failure became brutally clear. There were holes everywhere. One was high on the backing board. Another was completely off to the side. Of the 5 shots that had actually hit the paper, they were scattered in a foot-wide, random pattern, a chaotic constellation of pure error. It was not a group. It was a confession. His friends were speechless. Dave looked away, pretending to be fascinated by the ceiling. Tom stared at the ground, his face burning with secondhand embarrassment. A few of the other shooters just shook their heads slowly, a universal gesture of pity and contempt. Red tried to save face. He slapped the target onto the bench with a loud clatter. "The wind's really picking up back there," he mumbled, the excuse flimsy and pathetic in the dead quiet. "And this scope is way off. I told you guys I needed to re-zero it." He was talking to his friends, but his eyes darted toward the young woman, desperately looking for a sign of her reaction. He wanted to see her gloat, to see her smirk, anything that would validate his anger and frustration. But he saw nothing. She simply watched him with that same calm, unreadable expression. Her lack of reaction was more infuriating than any taunt could ever be. Then it was her turn. She did not rush. She did not celebrate. She did not even acknowledge his dismal performance. She simply stepped forward to take her place at the line. The crowd seemed to part for her, their silent respect a tangible thing. She picked up her pistol. The motion was fluid and graceful, a stark contrast to his clumsy, jerky movements. She loaded the magazine, the click of it seeding into the grip a soft, final sound. She stood there for a moment, just looking down the long lane at her target. She was not seeing the distance as a challenge or a source of pressure. To her, it was just a fact, a part of the equation. Her entire body seemed to settle into a state of perfect equilibrium. Her feet were planted solidly. Her knees were slightly bent, not locked. Her shoulders were relaxed, her back straight. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary tension. She was a picture of efficiency. She raised the pistol. Her arms came up in a single, smooth motion. Her grip was high and tight, her wrists locked, creating a solid platform from which the recoil could not escape. She did not use the high-tech, bulky ear protection the men wore. She had simple, effective headphones that allowed her to maintain a clean cheek weld and a consistent sight picture. She was using iron sights, the simple, unmagnified metal posts on the top of her pistol. At 50 yards, this was a feat of pure, unassisted skill. It was a statement that her ability was in her hands and her eyes, not in expensive glass. The crowd held its breath. The range was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. The only sounds were the low hum of the ventilation and the distant, rhythmic tick-tock of a clock on the wall, a sound that was suddenly and deafeningly loud. Red watched her, his anger now replaced by a dawning, horrifying comprehension. He was seeing the difference between a man who plays with guns and a person who understands shooting. He was seeing a master at work. She stood there perfectly still, the little black front sight post, hovering over the distant, blurry target. She was not just aiming, she was becoming one with the gun. Time seemed to slow down. The world outside her lane, the men, the audience, all of it dissolved. There was only her, the pistol, and the target. She took a slow, deep breath. She let it out, and just as the last of the air was leaving her body, a quiet moment of perfect stillness, the single, sharp, clean report of the pistol shattered the silence. Crack. It was a beautiful sound. A pure sound. A shot that sounded like it was meant to be. There was no celebration. No change in her expression. She simply cycled the slide, ejecting the spent brass, which tumbled through the air with a soft metallic clatter onto the floor. She settled back into her stance, the process starting over exactly as it had before. Breath, aim, squeeze, crack, another shot. Another perfect, calm execution. 5 times she repeated the process. Each shot was its own small universe of discipline. Each crack echoed the previous one, a steady, unhurried rhythm of competence. There was no hurry. There was no anxiety. There was only the process. The final shot echoed, and then there was silence again. A silence deeper and more profound than any before. She lowered the pistol, sifted it, and placed it gently on the bench. Her performance was complete. The whole range seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the verdict. Gus, the range officer, had moved to the window, his face a mask of intense curiosity. He had seen a lot of good shooting in his time, but this was different. This was art. The young woman simply stood by her bench, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, and waited for her target to come back. The motor whirred, and the long, agonizingly slow journey began. The target came closer, the black silhouette growing larger and larger. At first it looked like she had missed. The paper was clean, except for a single, dark hole right in the center of the X-ring. But as it came closer, the crowd began to murmur. They saw it. The single hole was not a single hole. It was a tight cluster. The target reached the end of the rail. Gus lifted it from the carrier, holding it up for everyone to see. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. There in the dead center of the bullseye was a group of 5 holes so tight they were all tearing through the same piece of paper. The entire cluster could have been covered with a $50 coin. It was not just a good grouping. It was a flawless, professional, world-class grouping. It was the kind of shot that belonged in a national championship, not a casual Saturday morning at a public range. The contrast was absolute. It was not just the difference between a good shot and a bad shot. It was the difference between noise and silence, between chaos and order, between arrogance and humility. Her quiet, surgical precision had completely and utterly annihilated his loud, chaotic display. Red stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and utter soul-crushing humiliation. He stared at her target, then at his own, a pathetic mess of scattered holes. The reality of his failure washed over him in a cold, unstoppable wave. He had been so sure of himself, so loud, so cruel, and she had not just beaten him. She had made a fool of him without saying a single word. Her skill was a statement so powerful it needed no explanation. The silence that followed her performance was the loudest sound he had ever heard. The silence in the shooting range was a living thing. It was heavy, thick, and absolute. It was the kind of quiet that follows a thunderclap, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. The target, held up by Gus, the range officer, was the epicenter of a silent earthquake. Every person who saw it understood the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just shooting. It was a statement, a lesson delivered without a single word. The 5 tiny holes, grouped so tightly in the center of the target, were a perfect, damning indictment of the loud, messy display that had come before it. Red, the man in the red shirt, stared at the target as if it were a venomous snake. His face, which had been flushed with arrogance and then frustration, was now pale, the blood drained from it by the cold wave of public humiliation. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. There was nothing to say. No excuse could bridge the chasm between his scattered, amateurish shots and her tight, professional grouping. He felt the weight of every gaze upon him, but it wasn't the weight of admiration he had craved. It was the crushing burden of shame. He had walked in wanting to be the king of the range, and in a matter of minutes, he had become its fool. His friends, Dave and Tom, stood behind him, looking everywhere but at him. Their earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by a deep, second-hand embarrassment. They were suddenly just 2 guys standing with a man who had been thoroughly and publicly outmatched. Got Gus. The range officer finally lowered the target. He looked at the young woman, and a slow, genuine smile of pure respect spread across his weathered face. It was a look he gave to very few people. He had seen 1,000 tough guys with expensive guns, but he recognized true quiet skill when he saw it. He turned his gaze to the defeated man in the red shirt, and his smile faded, replaced by a stern, no-nonsense expression. He wasn't angry, just firm. He was the keeper of order in this place, and order had to be restored. "Pay the lady," Gus said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the final authority of a judge's gavel. It was a simple command, not a suggestion. It cut through the tension and settled the matter once and for all. Red flinched as if he'd been struck. For a brief moment, defiance flickered in his eyes, a last, desperate remnant of his ego trying to rally. He looked at the crowd, at his friends, at Gus, and finally at the young woman. But there was no escape. He was trapped in the center of the stage he had tried so hard to command. With a stiff, robotic movement, he reached for his back pocket. His wallet felt heavy in his hand, as if it were full of stones instead of money. He fumbled with the leather, his fingers clumsy and uncooperative. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill, the vibrant green of the currency suddenly looking garish and foolish in the muted light of the range. He held the money out. But he couldn't bring himself to look at her. His eyes were fixed on some point on the concrete floor, a point that held a deep and shameful fascination for him. The young woman reached out and took the bill from his hand. Her fingers brushed his for a brief, cold second. He flinched again. She did not say a word. There was no thank you, no smug "I told you so." Her silence was a final, merciful blow, acknowledging his defeat without rubbing salt in the wound. She simply folded the bill calmly and methodically, and tucked it into the front pocket of her jeans, a small, neat rectangle of proof. That was it. The transaction was complete. The story was over. Without another word, Red turned away. His shoulders were slumped, his posture a picture of utter defeat. He and his friends began to pack their gear, not with the careless, loud abandon of their arrival, but with a quiet, fumbling haste. The clatter of their expensive equipment now sounded sad and hollow, the sounds of a retreat. They moved with a single purpose: to get out of that range, to escape the silent judgment of the people who had seen it all. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't look at anyone. They just gathered their things and walked away, their expensive gear suddenly looking like a costume that no longer fit. The heavy door swung shut behind them, and with it, the last echo of their arrogance vanished from the range. The moment they were gone, the atmosphere in the building seemed to change. It was as if the room had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. The tension dissipated, replaced by a quiet, buzzing energy of respect. A few of the onlookers gave the young woman subtle nods of acknowledgement as they returned to their own lanes. There was no applause, no cheering. That would have been too loud, too much like the performance the men had put on. Instead, there was a shared, unspoken understanding. They had all just witnessed something special. An older gentleman in the lane next to her, a man with kind eyes and calloused hands, carefully unloaded his own revolver. He turned to her, his expression one of pure curiosity and admiration. "That was some of the finest shooting I have ever seen," he said, his voice soft and full of genuine wonder. "I've been coming to this range for 20 years, and I don't think I've ever seen a group like that at 50 yards. Not with a pistol." For the first time since the contest began, a small, genuine smile touched the young woman's lips. It was a shy smile, a little tired, but it transformed her face, lighting up her eyes. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was still quiet, but it was warmer now. "Your father teach you to shoot like that?" the man asked, leaning against the partition, his interest clearly piqued. It was the most common question she got. She shook her head slightly, her gaze softening as she thought about the answer. "My grandfather," she said softly. The name hung in the air with a sense of deep affection. "He always said the loudest mouths make the worst shots." The older man let out a chuckle, a warm, hearty sound. "Your grandfather was a very wise man. A very wise man indeed." He nodded one more time, a gesture of profound respect, and then turned back to his own lane. Leaving her to her thoughts, she finished her session in peace. The remaining shots she fired were just like the ones before, deliberate, focused, and perfectly placed. But now they were just for her. The performance was over. The lesson had been taught and learned. She packed her gear with the same calm, methodical grace she had displayed from the beginning. The pistol went back into its case, the ammunition into its box, her headphones and glasses into their designated spots. Everything had a place. It was the same order she sought in the stacks of the library, same structure that brought her comfort. As she was about to leave, Gus, the range officer, came out from his office. He walked over to her, his steps slow and deliberate. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice low and sincere. "It's not every day we get to see a clinic put on like that." "Spersis is practicing," she said, a little embarrassed by the attention. "You were doing a lot more than that," Gus insisted. "Sometimes this place gets too full of guys who think their expensive gear makes them experts. It's good for them to see what real skill looks like. It's good for all of us." He paused, then added, "Your grandfather would be proud." She smiled again, a true, heartfelt smile. "I hope so." With a final nod, she picked up her case and walked toward the exit. The air in the range was back to normal, the familiar rhythm of individual shots echoing once more. But something felt different. The air seemed a little cleaner, the focus a little sharper. The ghost of her perfect shot hung in the air far longer than the men's mockery ever could. As the heavy door swung shut behind her, she stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, the quiet confidence she carried inside her, feeling a little more solid, a little more real. It had been a trip to the range, just like any other, but for everyone who was there, it was a day they wouldn't soon forget.